March, Book 3, by John Lewis and Andrew Aydin. Pages 212 through 227. March 9, 1965. While I was in the hospital and SNCC and SCLC worked on the courts, more than 2,000 people assembled in Selma for a second march. But there were rumors all morning that this march might not be allowed to proceed. "That is your bridge! You've got the right to march on it!" That didn't sit well with Willie Ricks, a SNCC organizer from Tennessee. "If Sheriff Clark says don't march, what are y'all gonna do?" "We're gonna march!" "If George Wallace says don't march, what are y'all gonna do?" "We're gonna march!" "If Judge Johnson says don't march, what are y'all gonna do?" "We're gonna march!" "If Judge Hare says don't march, what are y'all gonna do?" "We're gonna march!" "If your mama says don't march, what are you gonna do?" "We're gonna march!" "If the NAACP says don't march, what are y'all gonna do?" "We're gonna march!" "If Martin Luther King says don't march, what are y'all gonna do?" Worried that things might get out of hand, Andy Young hurried to restore order before Dr. King began the march. Finally, they set out. "If you can't be nonviolent, don't get in here. If you can't accept blows without retaliating, don't get in the line." "Halt!" "We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday." The court had not granted our request for an injunction against Alabama. In fact, it had issued an order against us, prohibiting any march from Selma to Montgomery until a hearing later that week. But there was too much at stake to cancel. "We will go back to the church now." So Dr. King had made an agreement with federal officials to march only to the bridge as a statement and then turn back to await the hearing. But Dr. King didn't tell any of the marchers beforehand. It became known as Turnaround Tuesday. I was still in the hospital, but I later heard that Jim Foreman exploded, denouncing Dr. King's trickery and saying that this was the last straw. "It's time for SNCC to do something on our own." SNCC decided to go ahead to Montgomery for a student siege on the state capitol, as Diane and Bevel had suggested over a year earlier. I was released from the hospital that Tuesday night. I was still in a lot of pain. My head was pounding. I had no problem with what Dr. King did. I thought it was keeping with the spirit of the movement. There comes a time when you must retreat and come back to fight another day. Federal District Judge Frank Johnson had issued the ruling, the same judge that had issued an injunction to help us get out of Montgomery during the Freedom Ride. I knew he would be fair and most likely give us what we were asking for if we showed respect for his rules. But most of my colleagues in SNCC disagreed with me. They were sick of rules and procedures. More and more, they were becoming sick of me. "Mr. Lewis!" Click! Psh! "Mr. Lewis! Can you say a few words regarding—" "Mr. Lewis, a word! Is it true that a major split has formed between SNCC and SCLC? Did Dr. King make plans to lead marches on a dead-end protest for political reasons? Do you plan on pressing charges on the state of Alabama? How can there be a split between two groups that never pretended to be one? I am not going to engage in any public discussion of organizational problems. SCLC is not the enemy. George Wallace and segregation are the enemy." It was amazing to see all of the people streaming into Selma. Hundreds and thousands of people, so moved by what they saw of Bloody Sunday that they just had to be there. After that night's rally, 3 Unitarian ministers, James Reeb, Orloff Miller, and Clark Olson, got turned around on their way home from dinner and ended up near a notorious hangout for Klansmen. Hey, you! Whap, thump, crunch! Now you know what it's like to be a real one. Ha! James Reeb took the worst of it, and it didn't look like he would survive. News of his brutal assault dominated headlines as I went to Montgomery, appearing at Judge Johnson's hearing, which Dr. King agreed to wait for. SCLC's request for an injunction to block state interference and allow a Selma to Montgomery march. Where were you hit, Mr. Lewis? I was hit on my head, right here. And what were you hit with? I was hit with a billy club, and I saw the state trooper who hit me. How many times were you hit? I was hit twice. Once when I was lying down and attempting to get up. Do we understand you say you were hit and then attempted to get up and were hit again? Right. Word came a short time later that Reverend James Reeb had died. The hearings went on for several days, and more than a dozen witnesses were called, including FBI agents who witnessed the attack, and even Colonel Al Lingo of the Alabama State Troopers. Though Lingo didn't come out and say it that day, it was easy to infer that the state troopers' orders had come directly from George Wallace. When the hearings recessed for the weekend, I flew to New York City to take part in a sympathy rally. Nearly 30,000 people participated in the march there, and they took place in other cities all over the country. More than 15,000 people turned out in Washington, D.C. to hear Fannie Lou Hamer. It's time now to stop begging them for what should have been done 100 years ago. We have stood up on our feet, and God knows we're on our way. Across the street, George Wallace met with President Johnson in an attempt to convince him to stop the Selma March. Unfortunately for Wallace, his pleas backfired. The events of last Sunday cannot and will not be repeated, but the demonstrations in Selma have a much larger meaning. They are a protest against the deep and very unjust flaw in American democracy itself. 95 years ago, our Constitution was amended to require that no American be denied the right to vote because of race or color. Almost a century later, many Americans are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Therefore, this Monday, I will send to the Congress a request for legislation to carry out this amendment of the Constitution. Wherever there is discrimination, this law will strike down all restrictions used to deny people the right to vote. If state officials refuse to cooperate, then citizens will be registered by federal officials. Talk. Monday evening, Dr. King and I returned to Selma to watch the president's speech in the home of Dr. Jackson, the town dentist. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There were long-suffering men and women peacefully protested. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many of them were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed. But there is cause for hope and for faith in our democracy, in what is happening here tonight. For the cries of pain and the hymns and protests of oppressed people have summoned into convocation all the majesty of this great government. In our time, we have come to live with the moments of great crisis. Our lives have been marked with debate about great issues of war and peace, issues of prosperity and depression. But rarely in any time does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy, and should we double our wealth and conquer the stars, and still be unequal to this issue, then we will have failed as a people and as a nation. For with a country as with a person, what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of an American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome. It was one of the most moving speeches I ever heard an American president give on civil rights. March 16, 1965. Beulah Baptist Church, Montgomery, Alabama. Not everyone was as moved as I was by the president's speech. There's only one man in the country who can stop George Wallace and those posses. These problems will not be solved until the man in that shaggy old place called the White House begins to shake and gets on the phone and says, "Now listen, George, we're coming down there and throw you in jail if you don't stop that mess." I said it today, and I'll say it again. If we can't sit at the table of democracy, we'll knock the legs off. They were shocked. I was not. I'd heard Foreman use that kind of language many times at SNCC meetings, but it was not the language or the message of nonviolence. It pointed down a road where SNCC was headed that I knew I would not be able to travel. Unbelievable. Hey, can we just pipe down? I feel like... Now, I'm not satisfied as long as the Negro sees life as a long and empty corridor with a no-exit sign at the end. The cup of endurance has run over. Dr. King! The judge has issued his ruling. The injunction has been granted. The march from Selma to Montgomery will be allowed. The march was set, March 21st, exactly 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday.